asynchronous code loading, bundle splitting. On this blue collar coder video, we are going to take a look at these concepts in depth. I'm Jack Herrington, a principal full stack software engineer. So you want to make your bundle sizes smaller. You want to make your application more efficient by loading up quickly and then loading in the code as you need it. You may even want to go and load code from other locations. All of this and more is what we're going to do in this video. And by the end, you will be an asynchronous code loading master. Let's jump right into it. All right, so this is our starting directory. It's the code splitting directory. And into that, I'm going to create a React app called home in JavaScript mode. All right, let's bring up this directory in VS Code. Okay, now I'm going to bring up the console and then go into that home directory and do yarn start. And we have our app. Nice. Okay. Pretty good starting point. Now I'm going to go and remove most of this stuff from here. So I'll go into the app.js file. I'm going to remove pretty much everything in here. Put a div in there saying that this is our home app. And then I'm going to alter the CSS to just put it into the middle of the screen, give it a fixed width, and zoom it up so we can all see it. And there we go. Home app. Okay, cool. So let's start off with some data and a default export. Kind of a simple starting point of all this. And I'm going to create a file in here called names.js and put into it some names. My dogs, little guy, and Mimi. Okay, now we want to go and put that on the screen somewhere. So let's go back over into here and I'm going to import that. Import names from the names file. And then I'm just going to go and create a div where I'm going to JSON stringify that. And put that right into our page. And let's go take a look. And there you go. Nice array of data. So now let's go over to our network panel and see how this is loading up. So now when I do a refresh, I can see that I primarily get that bundle. There's some other DevTools stuff in there, but it's the 327 kilobyte bundle that has React in it and has our app, including that data in it. So how do we go and load this data asynchronously? Well, one way to do that is to put a button on there and we'll say load. And then when we click that button, we're going to go and asynchronously import that data. So we need a place to put it. So I'm going to do use state and then use that use state to create a names value. And so now we can remove that import. And then finally, I need to go and actually do the load. So let's do on load. And we'll set it to the on click here. And here we're going to do an asynchronous import. So we're going to say import, and now it's a function. And what I can do is I can say bring in names, and that's a promise. And that's going to give me, coming back, a module. And then I can set the names to the default that comes in through the module. Now we'll also have a look and put in the console what that module looks like so we can see what comes back. Well, let's give it a try. Now let's make this a little bigger so that everybody can see it. So now when I do refresh, we get the bundle as just as we did before, but when I click load, we can see that we are bringing in this additional names file on the fly. So kind of cool. Nice. And we are actually loading it over here. Now let's go take a look in that console and see what we're actually getting back. We're getting a module and it's got default on it. And that default is that list of names. So let's see how this works with named exports. So I'm going to go create another file called utilities.js. I'm going to paste in there a make uppercase utility. It takes an array and it just returns all of the strings in that array turned in uppercase. So now let's bring it in using a normal import. We just bring it in as make uppercase. And now let's just wrap that default value that we get back, that array of names, in our make uppercase. And that will just uppercase all of the items in that array. Now let's try it again. Hey, Mimi is now uppercase. She was lowercase before, now she's uppercase. So this works, but let's say that we want to go and make that utilities module also dynamically imported. So let's go and remove it there. That's going to tell us that, hey, that no longer exists. All right, so let's get rid of this console log, and then let's get rid of this make uppercase because we no longer have that. Let's try it again, see if it works. Yep, works just fine. And the next thing we want to do is asynchronously import that utilities module. So I'll bring that in, say import utilities. And then in this case, we get back module just like we did before, but we're just going to destructure it because we have named exports. This make uppercase here is the same make uppercase over here, just like that. So now we go and get the names that we currently have, and then we make those names uppercase. Okay, let's hit load and go. And now we make that uppercase, and we do it in 2 steps. And we can also see that in that network panel. So if I do a refresh again, we get that bundle, we hit load, we first get the names, and then we get the utilities. And now another thing to learn is that you can actually control the names of these chunks, and that's really important. So let's go over into our terminal again, and we'll do yarn build. And now I'm going to bring up VS Code on that build directory that was created. And into that directory, we've got a static directory, a JavaScript directory, and we can see that we have some chunks. We've got the main chunk, which is the main bundle, and then we got these numbered chunks, and we don't really know which one is which. So I don't know, let's go and take a look. This one's names is 310, I guess, and 787 maybe utilities? Nah. Okay, so we want to be able to name and control those chunks because that might give us some cacheability later if we don't change the contents of those. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and do this on utilities. So all I need to do is add a special comment in here. And we'll say webpack chunk name, and I'm going to call this utilities. And now let's start this guy up again. And now when I hit load, we can see that now this chunk is called utilities. So we can kind of control that chunking behavior and the names that are given to those chunks so that later on, if we don't change the contents of those chunks, then the client won't actually have to reload them if they're in cache. It's great. Okay, so before we get off this topic, let's talk a little bit about how to clean up this promises code. I'm not exactly happy with what we have here. So let's go and close out these files. And what I'm going to do is just make this an async function. And then I'm just going to use await for this stuff. So I'm going to say that the names is equal to the await of the import. And then we're going to get the default out of it. All right, that looks good. So the next thing we want to do is get uppercase. So I'm going to have make uppercase equal to awaiting this import. And then going and getting make uppercase off of the end of that. And now let's go down here and excise this set names. And then we will just do make uppercase with the names. Okay, I think that's going to work pretty well. Let's take a look. Perfect. And now that reads a whole lot better than what we had before for sure. So asynchronously loading data and functions is obviously very cool, but what we might want to do is also asynchronously load components. So let's go see how we can do that. So I'm going to go create a new file here. We're going to call it my default component.jsx. And then I'm going to paste in some simple code here. In this case, this is just a React component. It says component exported via default. And that's why I called it my default component, because it's exported as the default. So let's save that out. And now what we want to do is just try it out. So I'm just going to bring in import my default component from the local file, and we will go and put it into our React app, save it out. And so this works, and that's great. It's always a good thing to do to make sure that your regular import works before trying the asynchronous version. Maybe you exported it as a named export as opposed to a default export. Maybe you didn't export it at all. There's all kinds of different ways that you can mess this up. So it's good to know with a regular import before you actually try the asynchronous version. Okay, so let's go back and let's try this asynchronously. So let's get rid of our regular import here. And now we're going to go and create some state. We're going to create a state. And we'll call this my default component. And we'll have set my default component. And it'll start off as null. And we'll say, hey, if we have a my default component, then render it. Okay, cool enough. Let's see if this works. Yeah, it works just fine. Okay, so now we just want to go and import it, right? That should be easy enough. So we'll go over here into our onload. And when we click onload, we're going to go and asynchronously import that my default component, get the default export, which we know is the right thing. And then we're going to go and set that state value, and that should set it. And then we will get the refresh and the re-render and give it a try. So let's hit it, load, go, boom. What happened here? Okay, so let's go take a look in our console. Okay, so what we're getting from React is we're getting an issue where an element type is invalid. I expected a string, but got an object. So, okay, that's a little bit weird. So what we want to do is actually wrap this component once we get it back. So what we're going to do is create a new function in here called load component. And I'm going to bring in React as well. And what load component does is it brings in an import function, and then it returns a new class component. Sorry about that, but that's the best way that I could figure out how to do this. So we have a constructor, it takes some props, and we have the component, which is a state. Then when we mount, we call that import function that we had, and then we set the state with that component. And then when we render, we check to see if there is a component, and then we then render that component with the given props. So how do we actually use this thing? So let's go over here to here. And now we'll say my default component is load component, and we'll just give it the import of my default component. And now we can get rid of this state down here. We can get rid of this code. All right, now this should probably do. Let's give it a try. And yes, that actually works. We get the component exported via default. So this is actually loading it asynchronously, but let's actually try that out just to make sure. What we're going to do here is use names as a switch. Basically say, well, if we have names, then go off and render that component. So let's hit refresh on this. And now we don't have the component. Let's go over into our network panel and see. Now pull down that console and we can see that we got bundle there. Let's refresh again. Let's hit load and we can see that now we're loading the my default component asynchronously only when we've got the names. And so that acts as essentially a switch to make sure that we go and get it only when we need it. Nice. But of course, this is kind of crazy. You don't really need to do this. There is actually React.Lazy built into the framework. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually copy this out. And we are going to create a new file in here called unused.js and paste that in there. Now, this is just because over in GitHub, there is the full source of this example. And if you like this, then you can, of course, use it. I didn't want to get rid of it entirely. But what we really want to do here is instead use React.Lazy. All right, let's give that a try. And we'll hit refresh. And then we'll hit load. And we're going to get a different error here. In this one, we're going to be talking about how we don't have a suspense around this. So what I want to do is wrap this thing in a react.suspense. So we'll create a react.suspense. And we will wrap our component in our react suspense. That should do it, right? I'll hit load, and now we get an issue around there being no fallback. Okay, cool. So what a suspense needs is it needs an additional property called fallback. And what fallback does is give some sort of UI when it's not ready. So div, and let's say just loading or something like that. Now let's give it a try. And there we go, no problem. For a second there, or a millisecond, we got a little bit of loading, but there you go. So nice asynchronous loading, and we're using the React.Lazy feature built in to the framework. All right, so if you go over to the React docs and you go take a look down at code splitting, and in particular, suspense, you'll find that the React.Lazy and suspense are not yet available for server-side rendering, and there's some issues around those. So what they recommend instead is to use loadable components. So that's what we're going to use. We're going to use this loadable components library over here, and let's give that a try, but let's go and do it over in a different app. And the reason that I want to do that is I want to show you a really cool feature of Webpack 5 that you may not have seen before. But let's start off with our loadable components. Let me close out a bunch of these files and then create a new terminal. And into that, do another yarn create React app. In this case, I'm going to call the application product. It's a product page. I'm imagining we're doing some sort of e-commerce site. All right, with that done, I'm going to go into that product directory. And before I yarn start that, I'm going to make a few small revisions. So the first thing is over in package, I'm going to go and put a port on the start. And that's going to put it on port 3001 because we already have something on port 3000, that original home app. And now let's start it up. Okay, cool. Looks like what we had before. So let's go and make some revisions to that. I'm going to go over into our index.css. And in this case, I'm going to make the background light green, but everything else is going to be much the same. Over in that app, I'm going to go and get rid of most of it. And then we'll create a div in there called product app. Nice. So now that we can get a sense that these two are different, let's go and change that title on there to make sure that we can see in the title bar that they're different. So I'll go over here into the public, index.html, scroll down, find React app, and call that home app. And then over in the product app, we'll do the same thing, but give it a different name. So we'll call that product app. All right, now we can see in the title bar that we have two different things. All right, the next thing we want to do is go and add in that loadable components library. So I'm going to do yarn add loadable component, and then I'll start up the app again. And now I'm going to create a whole file full of components. I'm going to create a new file called mycomponents.jsx and paste in our first component, which would be the def or default component. And now again, to start out, I'm going to do that regular import. So we'll import def component from my components, and then we'll try them out. Def component. Look, awesome, perfect, good, works right off. So let's instead use loadable. So then I'm going to import that loadable from that library. And then I'm going to do something very, very similar to what I did earlier with my little loadable function and call loadable and then give it the asynchronous import. And that's going to give us back def component. And all we need to do then is just reuse it. So let's give it a try. Perfect. Right off the go. And let's see if it actually is doing asynchronous loading by seeing that it is a bundle split out. So there we go. Source my component. Perfect. Awesome. So that's even easier than React.Lazy and the suspense, but can it do even more? And yes, it can. So let's go over here and add some more components to our mycomponents.jsx file. In this case, we're going to have some named exports. So we're going to have name component 1 and name component 2. And now we could import those and try those out, but I think we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. We'll do another one here where we're saying named component 1. But how do we get into it and actually say we want this component as opposed to the default component? Because if I did this, I would get the default component in both cases. Not what I want. I want name component 1. Well, so what I can do is I can add on an option on here. There's a set of options you can give it. And one of those options is you can give it resolve component. And then you can get back the list of components. So let's call that components. And then from that list of components, we'll get named component 1. Hey, nice. Okay, cool. But even cooler, check this out. So I can do named component like that. And what I not only get is the list of components coming back, but I also get the properties of the particular component that I'm looking at. And so what I can do is instead of doing a specific value like that, I can give it an object dereference and then give it a template string and then say, I want named component where I'm going to use the props.index. And then I'll put in here name component and I'll give it index 2. And now I get name component 2. And I can give it index 1 and get index 1. How cool is that? Nice, right? All right, but the fun doesn't stop here. So I mentioned something about Webpack 5, and it turns out that Create React App Now is based on Webpack 5. And Webpack 5 brought in a really cool feature called Module Federation. And what Module Federation allows you to do is share code between applications. So in this case, we've been asynchronously loading code from our own app. What if you want to go and asynchronously load code from home, for example? So let's go over into home and make something that's actually worth getting. So we're going to go make a header over there. So I'm going to create a new file in here, and we're going to call it header.jsx. And into that, we're going to paste a nice component. It's a header component. It's got some, light blue background, dark blue text, some padding on it. We worked really hard on this awesome header. So let's go and bring it into our app to see what it looks like. Using just a regular import. And I'll put it up at the top of the page here. And now if I go over to the home app, we can see that we've got a header on the top. Beautiful, gorgeous looking header. So now the product team is like, hey, we want to use that header. We don't want to rewrite that ourselves. That seems like a lot of work that you guys put into that. So can we just reuse it? And well, one option would be for the home team to excise that header into, say, a shared NPM library. And that's certainly a good way to do it. But another way to do it would be to use Module Federation. So let's give this a try. I'm going to stop the home app. And then I'm going to bring in the React App Rewired library. And what that does is allow you to take a Create React app and actually make some modifications to core elements of it, like, for example, the Webpack configuration. And then from there, I need to create a new file in the root level directory called config overrides.js and paste into that my overrides. So the overrides are given the current configuration, including the webpack configuration, and they return a new configuration. Now, the last thing I need to do to make use of this is to change out React scripts in here with React app rewired. And now we should be able to yarn start it, and everything should work just fine. And it does. So let's start hacking on our overrides. So go back over here into our config overrides. And right up at the top, we're going to bring in the module federation plugin from Webpack. And then I'm going to get the list of current dependencies. Those are the dependencies that I have in my package.json, including React and React DOM, because when you use module federation, you're actually going to share the dependencies between the applications, and module federation actually arbitrates to make sure that if the host application already has React, then it doesn't actually download it from the other application. It does all that kind of cool stuff. So that's what we need the deps there for. Then we're going to say that our Webpack public path is auto. We're going to make sure that we have an array of plugins, and then to that array of plugins, we are going to add a module federation configuration. So we're going to unshift in, meaning that we're going to add this as the first plugin, a new module federation plugin. We're going to say that our name of our application is home, and that there is a remote entry file. I'll get to that in a second. Then we're going to expose that header that we created. So that's the ./header. Yeah, every key is going to be what you expose, and then the location of the module that you want to expose. And then there's that list of shared dependencies. So we're going to bring in the deps that we had before that we got from our package.json. But we're also going to say that React and React DOM are singletons. It's really important when you use hooks because React actually maintains a list of all the hooks as singletons. And if you don't register this way here, you may have different versions. You may have two different versions of React running simultaneously, which blows up. Okay, so let's save that out. And now because we made that change, we need to reboot our app. And we blow up. So let's go take a look in the console and see what it tells us about blowing up. And it tells us that we have a shared module that's not available for eager consumption. Now, I hear this issue a lot when people first start out with module federation. What you need to do is bootstrap your application. So what does that mean? So over here, we have our index.js file. And what we can see is that in this index.js file, we're actually starting right off the bat. We're going straight into the React DOM render, and we're not giving Webpack any amount of time to asynchronously load any dependencies it may have. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to copy this into a new file. I'll call it, for example, real index.js, but you can call it whatever you want. I'll paste that in there. And I'll go back into our index.js and then just simply asynchronously load it, as we've learned a bunch of times here how to do that. And I refresh, and now it works just fine. And what this allows Webpack to do is it gives us some breathing room to do that asynchronous importing that needs to bootstrap the app. Okay, so I mentioned remote entry. So what this has created is it's created a new file called remote entry.js, and that remote entry is essentially a manifest of all of the exported modules. So in this case, that just includes that header. So now the product team can go and reference that remote entry and include that header if it has module federation configured. So we're going to use a different methodology to enable module federation. On the product side, we're going to use a library called Krakow. All right, let's close out a bunch of these files. Go back into our terminal, and I'm going to stop that one. And into the product app, I'm going to install the Krakow library. Krakow works a lot like React App Rewired. It's essentially almost the same thing, just with different functionality. I know some folks use React App Rewired, some folks use Krakow. So this just gives you a nice example with both. Effectively, it's the same thing on both sides, just using two different libraries. Now for Krakow apps, in the root directory, you have a file called krakow.config.js. And into that, you just put an exported object. And then just like with React App Rewired, we're going to do, instead of React scripts, we're going to do something. In this case, we're going to do Krakow. And then we're going to yarn start and make sure that the app still works. And it does. Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's go back over here and we'll start hacking on our Krakow config. So the first thing we want to do is bring in that module federation plugin, as well as the dependencies that we had before. Now, Krakow does this slightly differently. You've got a bunch of keys with different things that you can configure. In this case, you're going to do the webpack configuration. And in this case, we'll give it a function called configure. It takes a config, and then we're going to go configure that. Of course, the first thing we need to do is just return it. And then we're going to set that public path to auto, make sure that we have plugins. And then into those plugins, we are going to unshift in a module federation plugin. And in this case, the name of the app is product. We have a remote entry file, but we're going to, in this case, say that we want a remote. So we want a remote from home, and that home has that manifest located at localhost 3000. So the rest of it is exactly the same. We want to say that we have React and React DOM and their singletons, and that should all just mesh up nicely. So now let's try and start our application again. And boom, we get the issue. So let's see what the issue is again. Going back in the console again, not available for eager consumption. So we know what to do in that case. We'll go over to source, go into that index, copy that out, create a new file called real index or what have you, and paste that in there. Go back into our index file, asynchronously import that to give Webpack a little breathing room. And now we're good. Awesome. Okay, here's where the fun really begins. So let's go back over into our app right here. And now I'm going to import header from home header. And I'm going to use it. Let's see. Header. Refresh. And now we have a header on our application, just like that. Boom. Okay, so now let's actually try this out and see if there actually is a live connection now between these two applications. Let's say that the home page application folks have now released a new version, and we'll go make that new version by saying that we're going to want this to be, for example, dark green, and we want that to be, well, still light blue. We'll say header v2 down here to give it some textual difference. So there we go. Now the product app has header v2 on it. The homepage app has header v2 on it. And there you go. So a live connection between these two applications. Let's sum up what we've learned in this video. We've talked about how to import data and functions, both as default exports and as named exports. We've learned how to name your chunks. We've learned how to import components 3 different ways, manually with React.Lazy and Suspense, and also with loadable components. We've learned how to import React components from defaults, also from named exports, and also we've learned how to use Module 5's awesome module federation functionality to share code between applications. So cool. Okay, well, I hope you feel like you've learned a lot about code splitting in this video. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments section down below. If you're interested in module federation, I have an entire playlist of module federation videos on this channel, and that's linked to in the description down below, as well as a book on module federation called Practical Module Federation. There's also linked to in the description. Of course, if you like the video, just hit that like button. If you really like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on that bell, and you'll be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder video comes out.